Well, as we get closer to the fall federal election, politicos start paying closer attention to what's happening in provincial politics. That's because a provincial government's popularity can have an effect on the outcome of the federal vote. Two new surveys out today give us a snapshot of the popularity of provincial premiers and what effect that might have on a fall election. In a moment, we will drill down on the numbers for Ontario Premier Doug Ford as he faces accusations that he has adjourned the Ontario legislature until the federal election to help Andrew Scheer get elected. But first, to a wider national survey of the approval ratings for Canada's premiers. Shachi Kurl is the Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute, and she joins me now from Vancouver. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, let's look at these latest survey numbers. First of all, the methodological question: when and where and how was this survey conducted?
Okay, when? May 28th to June 4th, so very recent numbers, fresh out of field. Where? All across the country in every province and territory, although we will talk about PEI in a moment.
Okay.
And how? So we surveyed this panel. We surveyed our panel, which is the Angus Reid Forum. It is an online panel of respondents, tens of thousands of them across the country. If people wish to find out more about our methodology, they can actually go to angusreid.org, because you and I could talk for about 20 minutes just on sampling methodology. But rest assured, a robust sample of more than 4,000 Canadians and a randomized representative online sample across the country.
Okay, let's look at the ratings that you saw. The ratings for the premiers. Let's go from high to low. What did you find?
So what's quite remarkable is for, the first time in a while, we see three provincial premiers who in their own provinces have job performance approval levels of over 60%. Usually provincial electorates have pretty testy relationships with their provincial leaders. Not in this case. Scott Moe has the approval of nearly 2/3 of his electorate. François Legault in Quebec, as Bill 21 unfolds, is only climbing in approval, actually. And now you have Jason Kenney joining that above 60 group. And of course, he is very much in the honeymoon period with Albertans. The election was just in April, very, very new, sworn in not that long ago, and was elected his government with a majority mandate, with a very strong mandate. So all of that leading to a sense, at least for now, among Albertans, that their premier is doing a good job.
Okay, now I want to mention, and you alluded to it, PEI, you don't have results for the Prince Edward Island's new premier, Dennis King. Why is that?
So we love you, PEI. Please don't send any red-headed assassins with potatoes after us. We're very sorry. It's just that population sizes being what they are, PEI's population is simply too small for us to report on a quarterly basis, and this is a quarterly survey, so it's every 3 months. And what you need from a sampling perspective is to be able to talk to a new or a fresh sample of Islanders every 3 months in order to get results that are sound and not basically going back to the same well to measure opinion over and over again. Population in PEI makes that really tough to do. So we do talk to Prince Edward Islanders. We just don't release those results because of that sampling issue.
Okay. Another question. How much of these approval ratings do you think has to do with time spent in office?
A lot of it. So a couple of things. It's always important to remember that approval isn't always a pure proxy for electability of a government. So initially you had talked about sort of support for governments or the popularities of these governments. In this case, when you have a premier who is either going into an election or just coming out of one, there can be some parallels. But really important to remember that you can also have premiers who are personally unpopular, but their party is running ahead of them, or vice versa. They can be personally very popular, but their party is in tough shape. In any event, the closer you are to having been elected or re-elected, the more likely you are to be in a place where the electorate feels pretty good about what you're doing. And we call that the honeymoon period. And I have seen over time trend lines where a premier starts at 60% approval. Let's talk about Stephen McNeil in Nova Scotia, who's now sitting at 16% approval. So often, the longer you're in office, the worse it gets for you.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Talking about trend lines, let's look at what's happening with Doug Ford, Premier Doug Ford in Ontario. What are you finding?
So it hasn't been that long for him. We're coming up on just about a year.
Yeah.
Doug Ford's government was elected with to a majority government with probably one of the smallest bases of popular vote. He was elected with 40% of the popular vote, the Ontario Progressive Conservatives were. So his approval now is sitting at about 36%. It's statistically unchanged from last quarter. And I would suggest that, you know what, he's more or less holding his own. That is his base, that 36%. This is a very polarizing time in Ontario. There are a lot of people up in arms over cuts and austerity, and particularly the austerity budget. Ford is often seen as a proxy for Andrew Scheer, and so that's got a lot of people riled up, particularly around social values issues. But, you know, the other thing that I think may be eroding his personal job approval numbers just a little bit, it has to do with things like autism funding. You know, there are conservative voters who have autistic children as well, who depend on intensive treatment early on in their years that can't be going over well with them. But what I would suggest, and we've heard this a little bit in the discourse over the last few weeks, that, you know, Ford is really hitting rock bottom. He's in trouble. You know, he'd definitely love to be back above 40%, but this is not the worst we've seen for a premier writ large, not by a long shot, and he is very much holding his own base at the moment.
Okay, well, to widen it and to look at the federal level and what this might mean for federal politics, what we're seeing, it looks like, what we're seeing is generally favorable ratings, notwithstanding Doug Ford, who's having some problems, for premiers who oppose Justin Trudeau's policies in a sort of a united front. How important could that be when factored into a federal election?
It can make for a pretty devastating barrier for Justin Trudeau to be able to cross, because there is nothing so popular and so populist in the small p sense of the word, not the way we've been using it in sort of the Trump era or in Europe, but there's nothing so popular and grassrootsy as running against Ottawa. So often when a premier's in trouble, he or she will make Ottawa the enemy. In this case, Ottawa's already been sort of baked in many provinces as a result of carbon pricing as the enemy. Jason Kenney campaigned on, "I will fight Justin Trudeau." Scott Moe is right there in lockstep with him, as is Brian Pollster, who's now promising that he's going to go to the polls in the next few months. You've got Doug Ford in there, plus in Atlantic Canada, Blaine Higgs. Dwight Ball has scraped through to hold on to a majority government or a minority government, but it's a loss of the majority. So really, you know, on carbon pricing in particular, Justin Trudeau has got François Legault in Quebec, and he's got John Horgan in British Columbia. And if you look at where the federal Liberals are really putting in a lot of energy and intensity, it is in BC, in Quebec, and of course in Ontario, where the polarizing reaction to the Ford government is one where the Liberals may feel that they have some opportunities to harness a sense of anger or frustration or backlash against the Ontario Conservatives and make the case to voters, well, do you really want a Conservative government both on Parliament Hill and at Queen's Park? I think also important to remember that in many cases, voters do opt for that balance. They don't necessarily want one side or lopsided government at both levels. They like having that sense of having two different points of view on the spectrum to balance things out.
Okay, I want to ask you just a quick snapper on a last question, because it is one of the more populous provinces, Quebec. Quebec Premier François Legault, and you mentioned the Liberals obviously looking to try and attract support in that region. François Legault was having problems, controversy over his legislation to ban religious symbols in the workplace for public servants. But the numbers are showing that he's not losing support; he seems to be gaining it.
No, the thing with Bill 21 and the ban on religious symbols for public servants is a really interesting issue, because at a high level, when you ask Quebecers, well, how do you feel about this legislation? They broadly support it. But then when you drill down and say, well, actually, which symbols are we talking about? Are we going to be, you know, hauling people wearing a crucifix off to the cop shop to have a ticket written up? Or are they going to lose their jobs if they're wearing the cross? Well, no, Quebecers are not okay about that. So this is very much a law that isn't about banning religious symbols, but banning certain religious symbols. And I think Legault has tried to sort of navigate those waters, skate those waters. You'll note that he sort of introduced the legislation, but we still don't understand what the regulations or what the enforcement of that legislation is truly going to look like. And so, right now he's at a place where he is tapping into something that is quite popular in Quebec as a broad sentiment, but hasn't really been tested. Meantime, he seemed to be standing up for his province on other issues, such as fighting against a renewed opportunity or a renewed idea to get Energy East pipeline going again, which is something we've heard the other Conservative premiers talking about, and he's saying hell no on that one. So, he's holding steady. I don't know the extent to which Justin Trudeau and François Legault are true, spiritual siblings on a lot of political issues. But the Liberals do see an opportunity for growth there. And as I mentioned, as they do in British Columbia as well.
Okay, fascinating to go through to drill through all of those details. I want to thank you for taking the time. Thanks for joining us, Shachi Kurl.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.